Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, host Casey Hentges up-pots our transplants to give them more room to grow before being set out in the garden. OSU turfgrass specialist Justin Moss has some tips to get our warm season lawns off to a quick start this spring. We revisit 10 tips for selecting bedding plants, and Casey has the hows and whys of pinching, deadheading, and disbudding bedding plants.
So if you started seedlings this spring, you might start looking at them thinking, now what do I do with them? Is it time to plant them? Do I need to put them in a larger pot? What is it that I need to do? Well, the first thing that you're looking for when you have your seedlings is what are called the first true leaves. And that's the leaves that reflect the actual plant that you planted. Now, a lot of times seedlings come up and they present these leaves, which are known as the seed leaves or the cotyledons. And this is actually part of the seed. And they'll emerge first, and that's what actually gives the seedling energy to then produce more roots and to grow more of those true leaves. These are what are known as the true leaves. And at this point, this is when we know that the seedling is off to a great start. It has established itself, it's got some roots, and it's starting to photosynthesize and create its own energy. Now, cotyledons can look different from plant to plant, but they don't reflect the plant itself. And so we can't identify a plant necessarily based off of the cotyledons, but be aware that they can look different. Here we have a morning glory, and you can see this is the traditional true leaf of a morning glory. But initially we had these cotyledons. Again, they're kind of a divided leaf, but they don't reflect or represent the true leaf at all. And so you can't really identify the plant based off of that cotyledon. So as the energy from those cotyledons go into the plant and it continues to grow, you can see the cotyledons just start to die and wilt down and eventually fall off. But at that point, you've got your plant established. It should be photosynthesizing and producing its own energy. Now again, I mentioned that cotyledons might look different. So here we have some tomato plants. And you can see the original cotyledons here have kind of a long linear shape to them. And they don't represent what the tomato plant looks like at all. Here you can see we've got a couple of sets of true leaves now growing, and these do represent a tomato plant. So you would be able to identify this as a tomato plant now at this point. So again, what we're waiting for on our seedlings is to find those first sets of true leaves to know that our seedling is well established and has some good roots. So at that point, you can take a look at this, and you can see here we've got a 6-pack that we planted, and for the most part we planted one seed in each one of these cells. Now over here we do have a little bit of a hitchhiker that got in there. This is a broccoli plant. So we don't want this broccoli to continue to grow because it'll provide competition for our tomato plant. So we're just going to go in there and pinch that out, and that'll prevent that from continuing to grow. And by pinching it or cutting it, we're not going to interfere with any root growth from that tomato. If we just pulled it out, then we would potentially damage some of the roots of that tomato. So this 6-pack, these little seedlings are good to go. We don't need to pot them up. They have plenty of room to grow out and until we need to plant them out in our garden. Now, some of you I know prefer to plant more than one seed in a cell at a time when you're doing that, and that's fine, but you might find that some of them came up, all of them came up, and so here we've got a few that have either 3 and in some cases even 4 little seedlings come up. And the thing about this is they provide competition for one another, and so we really again don't want all of them to grow because then they're all going to be weak. So you want to just go in there with your finger and either snip it back with your fingernail if you have fingernails, or you can just go in with some little snippers and then take out those just like that. Being cautious not to damage the one that you're wanting to keep. So at this point, those two will not continue growing. We have our main one here, and that will continue growing. The other option that you can do is to gently turn the cell over and pull out one of them that has multiple plants in there, and then gently tease the seedlings apart. Now this isn't necessarily the recommended way because again you can see that we might be causing some damage to the roots, but I know some people like to take advantage of all the seedlings that they might have grown, and so this is one option of doing that. So we're going to go ahead and sacrifice this little guy here in the middle and just gently tease these two bigger ones apart. And at this point we can now plant these up. You can see the amount of roots that are growing on there, and again we knew that those roots would be there because we've got true leaves on these seedlings. Now if you planted your seedlings in something like this, a peat pot or maybe one of these biocell foam things, you want to make sure that you get those definitely in a larger pot, because at this point you can see the roots are exposed and they need something more to grow in. So we need to give them bigger space for those roots to continue to grow and for the plant to continue to grow above. You can see we do have true leaves. This is a tomato plant, and how different that look is from the cotyledon. We do have two seedlings in here, and because these are in a foam core thing, really we're not going to be able to divide these apart. So I'm just going to come in here and snip one of these off. So we've got one seedling to pot up. Now you might notice that I don't have much soil or potting media in our pot here, and that's because it's just easier to go ahead and put our plant right in there and then fill in around it. You can see that we're planting the seedling back at the same depth that it has been growing at as we fill in more potting media around it. Now the thing also you want to be aware of is not to fill this pot up with potting media all the way to the top, because when you water it, then that's just going to wash off. So we've left a little bit of a gap there so that it works as a well to hold that water in as it percolates down over it. So again, we had two seedlings in this, and we need to go ahead and trim one of them off. This one's more in the center, so that's why I'm choosing to cut this one back. But they're about the same plant, so there's no really reason why to pick one over the other. So we've got these done. Now we just need to give them some water. And at this point, they could use a very mild, weak, water-soluble fertilizer. So we've mixed some in here, and we're just going to go ahead and give those guys a drink now. All right, so we've got them watered in, and you might have noticed that that water kind of lets them flop a little bit because they're not quite rooted in, obviously. So you might just want to prop them up a little bit, make sure that soil is nice and tight around those roots. And at that point, once we've watered them, we want to make sure the water has gone all the way through and you're seeing it drain out the bottom. That's important so that we know the whole soil profile has gotten wet. Again, continue to water with a mild or weak fertilizer solution, and at this point they will continue growing and get bigger until you're ready to transplant them out into your garden.
Spring is almost here, and it's time to start thinking about mowing our yard for the season. And even though the grass may still be dormant, we can go out and give an early mowing, or sometimes referred to as a scalping, early in the spring. And then what we can do is remove some of the brown, dead material in our lawn, get that off the lawn, allow the sunlight to penetrate in, and allow that grass, that lawn, to green up a little bit sooner for us. So this is pretty important if we have a warm season lawn. Now if we have a cool season lawn, actually I wouldn't recommend this. Only for the warm season lawn. So a lot of Bermuda grass lawns out there, zoysia grass, even some buffalo grass. It's okay to remove that brown material, allow the sunlight to penetrate in, allow it to green up. Now when we talk about an early mowing or a scalping, we don't want to mow everything off so that we expose bare soil. If we expose bare soil, we're going to allow a place for weeds to come up and germinate and maybe cause us some trouble on down the line. So really what we want to do is just get that brown material off, mow it just like a normal mowing almost. The thing is, you may want to use a bagger and actually remove all that dead material rather than leaving it on the ground. That way it won't block the sunlight from penetrating in. Now this can be a big job if we're talking about removing all that dead leaf material. So you can do it yourself, bag it up, take it to a compost bin, mulch it somewhere. But also a lot of times it's sometimes worth it just for that first early mowing to hire a company to come out and do it. They've got large equipment, large baggers. They can knock it out really fast. If you'd like to do it yourself, I do recommend that you bag it up and compost it somewhere. Now, with the mowers and everything, what we want to do is just look at where we were mowing last season and then adjust it down maybe just a notch or a notch and a half and then go mow. And again, we don't want to put that thing all the way down to the ground. So that's what we have to be careful about. So you can adjust it, just go maybe 2 or 3 feet, see what it looks like. If you need to raise it, raise it. If you need to lower it, and go from there. And again, just make sure you get those clippings out of the way. Let the sunlight come in, you'll have a beautiful lawn, and it'll probably green up about 2 weeks earlier than normal.
It's that time of year to start heading to the nursery to buy our bedding plants, and it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the array of color that is offered at the nurseries. But before we start looking at the flowers and the colors, there's a few things I want you to consider when buying your bedding plants. Most bedding plants need just either potting soil or regular soil to grow in. But the first thing that you want to consider is where you're going to be planting these plants when you get home. What sort of environment do you have to offer these plants? Are you looking for something for full sun, maybe in full shade? Are you looking for something in a rock garden or a container? Think about those things and what you can offer the plant, what sort of environment you're asking that plant to grow in. The next thing you want to consider is what you're asking of the plant. Do you want something that's trelling, such as this tangerine vine here? Perhaps you want a lower growing ground cover, such as this gold dust with these lovely yellow flowers. Once you decide what it is, what features you're asking of the plant and looking for in the plant, you can also think about the color that you're wanting to get. And you've narrowed it down to the specific plant. It's time to start picking that plant up off the bench. So often when we pick a plant up off the bench, they're grouped together and they look good in mass, and you go to pick the one that you think is the best, and it turns out to be a little bit smaller. There's a few things to consider when you're buying that and picking that plant. You can see here we have a deep purple salvia. This plant is really a nice plant. You might notice that all of the vegetation is growing towards one side, and that's probably because where it was placed in the greenhouse, the sun exposure was on one side of it. It might have been near the edge of a bench. It might have had more plants pushed up against it, and so that caused it to grow in one direction. This isn't too much of a concern because once you put it out in the garden, it's going to fill out and look nice. Now, obviously, this one is pretty small. You can see it's been overwatered. There's some mold growing on the leaves and things like that. So this is one that you would want to avoid. Here we have another plant, this verbena. You can just see that there's not any new growth coming on this plant. It's kind of past its prime. All of the flowers are starting to fade on here. The leaves have some discoloration and they're much smaller and stunted looking. So we know that something has happened previously and it's not really in good health right now. Now here's another plant, this geranium. It looks pretty good, and I tend to focus on the new growth. The new growth is coming on strong. However, again, it has some discolored leaves down below. So that might be something that you just want to avoid if you can. Again, typically a good plant, but if you can avoid some of these leaves, do that. Here's another plant, and at first glance it might look good, but taking a closer look at the leaves, you'll see that there's some holes in those leaves. And that's because there's grasshopper damage. And in fact, we can see we have small grasshoppers that are still on this plant. Now, again, a grasshopper is going to jump away. It's not a major threat. We already have them out in our garden likely. But why buy a plant that already has damage on it if you can avoid it? Now, knowing your plant is important because here you might think something is going on with these leaves because they obviously kind of range in color. But this is actually how the plant is supposed to look. This is copper leaf, and the cultivar is called Inferno. And it can range from kind of this yellow to red to almost a purple burgundy on the leaf. So this is how the plant is supposed to look. So you might look at the massive plant and see what maybe is standing out. All of these plants have this range of color to them, so you know that's kind of typical on this plant. Again, when you're buying a plant, you might find that it's lopsided. So here we have a blue daze. It tends to grow more towards the left side of the pot. This plant would be a good spiller in a container because you can see how the foliage kind of drops over the edge of the pot. If you're worried about the fact that this side of the plant isn't growing, again, given enough room on the proper spacing, it will fill out nicely. It's just that real estate in a greenhouse is pretty expensive, so sometimes these plants are a little bit closer than they need to be out in the landscape. After you've looked at the upper growth of a plant, you want to look at what's going on underneath the plant, and you want to do this carefully. So this plant, you can see it's got a lot of new growth. This is a cleome. We've got some buds coming on. It looks pretty good. So we're going to go ahead, we put our fingers between the stems and gently turn it over and give the pot a tap. Now, if it's got a good amount of roots, and you don't need to necessarily pull the pot completely off, but you can see it's got a fair amount of white roots. Those are healthy roots. There is a little bit of circling going on with the roots, so if we were to take this plant home, we would want to tease those roots a little bit to separate them. But this has got a good root system to it. A plant that obviously is suffering, such as this one here, it might have just been potted up into this because it's a fairly small plant for this pot. You can see we don't see any roots. So we really don't know what's going on with this plant. Perhaps it's died back, perhaps it's been overwatered too much and the roots haven't grown well. But just know that if you're to buy a smaller plant and you don't see any roots underneath that plant, then the odds are that it might just have been potted up into that larger pot, but you're buying more potting soil than you are actually a plant. Here's a little lemon drop basil. Again, we're going to kind of tip this over and see. And you want to be careful because you don't want to mess up people's plants, but you can see that the soil is coming out, so we know that it's not rooted very well in that pot. Here's another one that I'll show you. It's rooted fairly decently. It could grow some more. There's no circling or anything, but this is a good plant and some good healthy roots growing there. After you've looked at the upper part of the plant and taken a peek at what's going on in the pot, then it's time to go back and look at those flowers. A lot of times, if I know a plant is the color that it's said to be, then I go ahead and buy a plant that's not in bloom. Just buying one with buds allows you to take that home and have a little bit more flower power in your own landscape. Now, if you're concerned that you might buy a plant and it might not be the true color that it says it is, you know, sometimes I've bought a clematis and it tends to be a different color than what they said it was. You might want to make sure to buy one that has a flower on it so you can ensure that you're getting the exact color that you want. So once you've determined where you're going to plant in your garden and what you're looking for in a plant when you get to the nursery, make sure to inspect both the top and the bottom for the health. This will give you the best purchase of bedding plants. Pinching, deadheading, and disbudding are a few terms that novice gardeners might be wondering, what exactly are we doing to our plants? But really, these are practices that you can do to help control the growth of plants. So first of all, we're going to talk about pinching. Pinching is the removal of something that might be a little bit leggy coming out of a plant, and what it is you can either pinch it with your fingers, but it's really a better practice to use small little snips such as this, and to go in there and trim right above the node of the next lower set of leaves, or however far back down you would like to trim it. So this is a way to control the growth habit. You can see here on this other coleus, again, we have a couple of stems that are sticking up a little bit higher. So we'll just come back into this lower set of leaves and trim that out. So pinching is a great way of controlling the height of a plant. And now why would you want to do this? Perhaps you have a plant that you're growing in a greenhouse and it's just getting a little bit too large. It's not quite time to plant it outside. And so you can go ahead and trim it back by snipping out some of that growth. And you can do this as far back as you want. And this is going to regulate and also create more of a bushy plant for you. So you can see we've trimmed it back by about a third. It's still got a nice shape to it. And each time you trim it back, you can see this is where we trimmed it. Now these two stems will continue to grow, and that's why it becomes bushier, because where you had one stem that you trimmed out, now you're going to have two stems growing from that point. You might have a house plant that has been inside all winter long and it's been stretching towards the light, towards the window or something, and it's gotten a little leggy that way also. So this would be an ideal application for pinching. So we're just going to go in, and you want to be as close as possible to that node right above that joint where the leaf stem connects to the main stem. You can see above here where it got pinched back, and somebody did not pinch it back far enough. And this is not necessarily a major problem, but can lead to disease because this part of the stem is not going to produce anything for us. And in fact, it's just going to start to kind of die back. So we're going to go ahead and remove that. It also kind of creates a tidier look to the plant. Now there's another situation where you might use deadheading. This is patchouli, it's an herb. You can see it got pinched back, and we're going to clean it up by pinching back those stems just a little bit more. But herbs, a lot of times we don't want them to flower because we're after the foliage. That's where the fragrance is in many herbs. And some herbs, once they start to bloom, then they'll die. So you might want to deadhead some of your herbs to prevent them from flowering. Here we have a geranium. Again, we're in the greenhouse. We're not ready to take these outside yet. So we're going to go ahead and trim back our flowers. This is called deadheading. So obviously we want to remove the flowers here because this will promote more growth, both of the vegetation and also the roots, before we get it out in the garden. But why would you want to deadhead plants that are already out in the garden? Again, there might be a couple of reasons. One, you have herbs and you're not ready for that plant to die, or you're after the vegetation more. But there also are aggressive seeds that you might want to prevent from spreading in your garden. So that would be another case in which you deadhead your plants. Now, similar to deadheading, there is also disbudding. So here we have a geranium that we're going to go ahead and remove these flowers because a plant only has so much carbohydrates and sugars, and right now it's sending energy into making these flowers, and we're not ready for it to flower just yet because nobody can really enjoy these flowers before they go out in the garden. So we're going to focus that energy back into this plant by removing those flower buds. When we know we're going to be putting them out in the garden, we'll go ahead and continue to let them flower at that point. Now finally, there's a couple of instances when you might do a combination. So this is a penta, and they're quite prolific bloomers, but sometimes you want to go ahead and remove those spent flowers. These aren't quite blooming just yet, but you can see it's getting a little bit leggy. So we're going to go ahead and pinch it back, but at the same time we're disbudding it as well. So now we have a plant that's a little bit shorter. It will again flush back out and be ready to go in the garden pretty soon. Deadheading, disbudding, and pinching don't have to be painful chores, but in fact are great ways to control the growth of your plants in the garden.
There are lots of great horticultural events this time of year. Be sure and consider these activities when you're making your plans for the weeks ahead. Next week, we'll transplant our cool season vegetables outside, and we'll have inspiration to get you ready for spring as we revisit a couple of our favorite gardens from last year. We hope you join us then for more TV you'll grow to love. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.